Great. So far, we've been talking about boundaries for water, boundaries between public and private. And now, as we enter the 9th chapter of Eruvin, which is actually the last proper chapter of Eruvin, the 10th chapter really belongs to Masechet Shabbat. So we're entering the last chapter. And rather than going, if you like, along the ground and in the water, we're going to rise up into the air. And then we're going to look at boundaries between different kinds of domains. But we're going to start by going up on the roof. So Rabbi Meir begins by saying, Kol gagot ha'ir ushut achat. All the roofs of a town are basically a single domain. And that would suggest you could carry from one to the other. Ubi levad shelo yehe gag gavo asara or namuch asara, divrei Rabbi Meir. As long as they're pretty much on the same level, and as long as you don't have to go up 10 tefachim or down 10 tefachim. And we've talked before about the fact that when you move in height 10 tefachim, effectively you move domain. It's you kind of 10 tefachim is a critical level. So according to Rabbi Meir, if you had, for example, a set of flat roofs across the whole town, you could carry from one flat roof to another flat roof without an eruv, right? So you certainly couldn't carry from the house to the house. But Rabbi Meir is saying you can carry from the roof to the roof, as if once you're up in roof space, the normal private and public boundaries don't apply. And the sages actually don't agree. The sages will say, look, no. The roof belongs to the house. So each roof is its own domain. Every roof has got its own domain, just like every house has its own domain. And Rabbi Shimon is going to disagree. And by the way, we're going to find from the Rambam that the halacha goes according to Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon is going to be even more expansive. Rabbi Shimon Omer, he says, Echad gagot ve'echad chatzerot ve'echad karpefot. Roofs and courtyards and karpufs. We've learned about a karpuf. A karpuf is a kind of a wood store behind the houses. It's the closest we actually have to something like a backyard. It's where you keep all your stuff. They're all the same. They're all one domain. Reshut echad. They're all one domain. Reshut echad. Lakelim sheshavtu l'tochan. With regard to objects that spent Shabbat inside them. Velo lakelim sheshavtu b'toch habayit, but not with regard to objects that were in the house when Shabbat began. And so we need to go back to principles here. If something is in a courtyard, we know if it's in a courtyard, we can carry it around on Shabbat. The courtyard's a closed area. It's its own area. We made the eruv to allow us to carry from the house to the courtyard. Carrying from a house to a courtyard is a big deal. Carrying around inside a courtyard is not such a big deal. And Rabbi Shimon is saying, fine, carrying inside a courtyard is not such a big deal. But actually, all of the courtyards in town, and by the way, all the karpufs, all the wood stores, and all the roofs, they all kind of join up to make one big domain. So actually, if there's a towel that's in one courtyard and it started Shabbat in that courtyard, you can carry it into another. And we've got an example of working according to Rabbi Shimon's principle. This is the principle of Rabbi Shimon. Everything is one domain. And look, we've got in the Gemara in Eruvin, it was taught in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda. It was taught in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said, Shahin lomdim Torah at Rabbi Shimon b'Tekoa. When we were learning with Rabbi Shimon in Tekoa, so we even heard about this place Tekoa. I'm not sure it's the same Tekoa that is south of Jerusalem. There are two Tekoas. There's one up in the Galil, and there's one down in south of Jerusalem. And I think the Tekoa here is the one up in the Galil. And Rabbi Shimon used to, the sages were all hanging out in the Galil at this point. I think we're in the Galil, not south of Jerusalem. But anyway, we were learning Torah with Rabbi Shimon in Tekoa, and we'd carry oil and a towel from roof to roof, and from roof to courtyard, and from courtyard to courtyard, and from courtyard to enclosure, and from enclosure to enclosure, until we got to the Ad Shehayinu until we got to the spring that we were going to take a dip in. So these guys would go for a dip in the spring on Shabbat. And they dry themselves off, and they'd rub oil into themselves, because people used to rub oil into themselves in those days, and they'd carry all that stuff, and they'd do it via all the roofs and the courtyards and the enclosures, so that they could get there and back from their houses on Shabbat. So that's the halacha. That's essentially what Rabbi Shimon's going on about. And the Bar Tanura says, obviously not with regard to things that were in the house when Shabbat began. So you have to leave the towel in the courtyard before Shabbat came in. And then he says the halakha is according to Rabbi Shimon. Okay, let's keep going. Let's look at more of these situations, more of these weird boundaries across transgressions of places around the town. And we're going to look now at a large roof and a small roof. And this is a picture which I picked up from Kahati, but actually there's quite a similar one in the Rambam, and in a minute we'll see a picture from the Rambam. And it's very simple. Look, here you've got the large roof and you've got the small roof, but the picture is illustrative because you can see that there's a boundary between them. And the large roof has essentially got four sides with an opening. That's the large roof. Yeah, you can see it's got four sides and an opening. And the small roof only has three sides, because the whole of the side of the small roof is opening. So the small roof doesn't really have four sides at all. And the Mishnah is going to play with that distinction. And in fact, we're going to play around with it in a number of different situations. The big place has just got a gap in its wall, but it still has a wall. The small place doesn't have a wall at all. So let's jump into the Mishnah. Gag gadol samuch lekatan, a big roof close to a small one. Hagadol mutar v'hakatan asur. The big one is permitted because it's an enclosed roof. Hakatan asur. The small one is forbidden because it doesn't have any boundary at all, this small roof. And similarly, what about a large courtyard which broke into a small courtyard? And I think so there's a breach in the wall. So can you imagine exactly the same picture, but there's a big courtyard and a small courtyard, and there's a breach in the wall. And the halakha is just the same. Gedola mutared uktana asura. The big one's permitted and the small one's forbidden. Mipnei shehi kefitra shel gedola, because the gap is just like a doorway into the big one. The gap's just like a doorway, and we know that kind of doorways don't invalidate a partition. And it can go the same way. Chatzar shenifritzaler shut harabim. What about a courtyard which broke into a public domain? So maybe here rather than having the courtyard breaking into another courtyard, we're going right out into the street. Someone who brings something from that courtyard into private space, or from private space into it, chayav. That means is liable to a sin offering. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. We know Rabbi Eliezer is always a little bit extreme, and he's certainly extreme on this one. The Chachamim omrim, and the sages say, probably from the breach actually, into the public space, or from the public space into it, patur, he's exempt. Mipnei shehi kekarmalit. So this courtyard, which is sort of broken into the public space, it's not really private space anymore, and it's not really public space. It's a karamelit. It's an in-between space. And actually, I mean, al pi halacha, it's forbidden to carry in a karamelit, but there's no, you don't have to. It's not a sur. You don't have to bring a sin offering if you carry in a karamelit. So the sages are a little bit more lightweight than Rabbi Yehuda, and the Baal Tanura makes that clear. By the way, he says patur aval asur. It's exempt from the sin offering, but it's also forbidden because it's not a public thoroughfare. It's a karamelit, and the halacha goes according to the sages. Now we're going to look at a courtyard which broke into the public domain and the Mishnah says from two directions. Chatzar sheni fritzal reshut harbim mishtei ruchoteha. V'chein beit habayit, v'chein bayit hanifratz mishtei ruchoteha. V'chein maboi shenitlu korotav ulechiav. A courtyard which broke into the public domain from two directions, or a house whose walls were breached from two directions. And we're going to include here the alley from which the crossbeam or the side post was removed. So here we seem to be talking about a wall which is actually breached on Shabbat, because the Mishnah goes on to say, Mutarin b'oto Shabbat, they're permitted on that Shabbat, v'asrin la'ati lavo, but they're forbidden for the future. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, this is according to Rabbi Yehuda. And the Rambam actually has a nice okay, the diagram's gone. Sorry, the diagram didn't come through the source sheet. When something is broken from two directions, it seems to be that it's broken on a corner. Let's just go back to our picture of the large and small roof for a sec. So if the wall is broken in the middle, then we can say, okay, that's just like a doorway. That's a doorway. If the wall's broken in the middle. If it's broken at the corner, we have trouble saying that that's a doorway. We don't have doors on the corners. At that point, we don't seem to be able to say, look, that's just like that might just be permitted, or it's just a karmelit. It's just a karmelit. And that's why there's a discussion as to whether it's permitted in general, and whether if this breakage happens on Shabbat, well, if it breakage happens on Shabbat, maybe it's okay. Maybe if it was okay when Shabbat came in, it should still be okay for the whole of Shabbat. We know, for example, if an eruv is kosher, when Shabbat comes in, it might be eaten during Shabbat, but the eruv still stands because it was there when Shabbat came in. And Rabbi Yossi is going to disagree. Rabbi Yossi Omeri mutarin la'oto Shabbat, mutarin la'ati lavo. Rabbi Yossi says, look, if it's permitted at Shabbat, it's permitted for the future, and vice versa. If it's prohibited in the future, it's prohibited for that Shabbat. You can't have this temporary state where it's just permitted for one Shabbat. And the Rambam explains. He says, okay, the halacha Rabbi Yossi. The halacha goes according to Rabbi Yossi. So we follow Rabbi Yossi. There's no temporary relief because this wall fell down on Shabbat. But then he makes it clear the eruv, which is eaten on Shabbat, always destroyed on Shabbat, that we get the benefit of that eruv through the whole of Shabbat. It doesn't matter that the eruv is eaten on Shabbat, and we've learned that principle before. But he said, the Rambam says, asur mipnei hasarat hamechitzat. He says, somehow clearing away the partition is different. You can't take away, you can take an eruv on Shabbat, and it's still legally valid. Maybe because an eruv is just a halachic device of the sages. But a mechitza, a partition, is a physical reality, and here the physical reality and the halachic reality match. So if you take it away on Shabbat, you just can't take advantage of it anymore.